I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Professor Delugian. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Therefore, Chatham House rule does not apply. So let's speak theoretically. So you mentioned geopolitics. The word has very compromised connotations on all over. Let me remind you that in Russia, it became current in 1994 when Liberal Democratic Party of Zhirinovsky gained 22% of the vote in the Duma election and claimed, since Mr. Zhirinovsky himself majored in Turkish language and history, he claimed the chairmanship of Foreign Relations Committee. So Yeltsin's presidential administration, in order to deny him this honor, had created specifically for Zhirinovsky the Committee on Geopolitics. There is actually some real history to that. It's also very compromised because it goes back to the 19th century German social science, which was wiped out in the Second World War and resulting in all the geopolitical thinking of the Nazis. However, the basic precepts are quite simple. Going back to Max Weber, that there are land powers, Russia is one, and there are sea powers, Great Britain is another. And they're very different, or as they used to joke in the times of Napoleonic Wars, it's the fight between whale and elephant. Sea powers are more market-oriented and more capitalist, simply because they rely on navies, and navies historically could double as merchant marines. So the United States is the latest big example in the Second World War. Land powers had to rely more on coercion, because for them, space is friction. They have to overcome space. They have to build roads and garrisons. They have to march enormous armies and supply them with food in March. Somehow they have to build roads and bridges and garrison, big expanses. Russia and Ottoman Empire are two typical examples. Now, if I had slightly more time, I would go into the usual joke of suggesting to imagine what the Economist magazine would look like in January 1500, AD 1500. So what would be the forecasts, expert forecasts for the beautiful 16th century that had just opened? And of course, Islam would be winning globally, and globally did not include the Americas at the time, just barely discovered. So there would be three big empires emerging very, very simultaneously. The Mughals in India, the Safavis in Iran, and the Ottomans, or Selim Yavuz Sultan, there's Selim the Grim Sultan in Ottoman Empire. They were all gunpowder empires. And of course, Chinese, as always, were the first in inventing gunpowder. In Europe, there was a very similar empire emerging, Habsburg Spain. But something happened in Europe, namely the Protestant Reformation, and Europe never developed one single empire like the rest. So I mean Ming China, Mughals in India, Safavis in Iran. So that was the norm for the 16th century. And part of that norm was Muscovy. It's not yet Russia. It's the Moscow Kingdom, or the Moscow Tsardom at the time, which overpowers the Tatar Khanates in the Volga. And that's how, have you ever wondered, how did Russia become big? It was not. Or why among the Eastern Slavs, there are so many Russians and much fewer, say, Bulgarians or Slovaks, if it ever occurred to you. So sometimes, so what I do in macro sociology, I ask these idiotic questions, which usually do not occur to any policymakers, and try to find answers. So the laws of geopolitics has some, not so much laws, but regularities. Like any game, if there are teams of players fighting, let's call it its own way, fighting, not playing, in the field, round after the round, there should be a simplification of the field. So this is what we observe in Europe. Look at the map of Europe at around 1500, it's patchwork. There would be probably 500, 540 different jurisdictions, many of them overlapping. Like today we have Andorra remaining from those glorious times. By the times of Napoleonic Wars, map makers would need probably 10 pencils to color the political map of European continent. By 1945, Europe was finished, essentially. It becomes this peaceful continent that we know today because everyone who could be defeated in Europe was defeated by that time. And this is where eventually, with American tutelage after the Second World War, we observe first the famous, it's not my expression, Jeffrey Baraclough famously observed in the 1950s, the dwarfing of Europe. It becomes a geopolitical dwarf continent of former defeated empires. France, but also Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, they're all former empires. European Union did a very good job integrating the club of these former empires, although some of them, like the United Kingdom, could not make up their mind, do they still have an empire, or they join the club of the defeated ones. Why did they do this? Because otherwise they were facing the geopolitical prospect of Italian city-states. Let me remind you, that there was the time, when the Republic of Venice was a serious player, economically and militarily. Florence was, whoever paid for the Renaissance. But then what happened to Augsburg, Lübeck? They became open-air museums, and this is what Europe is going to become if it doesn't turn itself into a geopolitical actor at the scale of at least China and North America. So this was the project of European Union, but the project ran into two more empires at the periphery of Europe, Turkey and Russia. So what do you do with those? In the 1990s, or still in the 1980s, actually, Soviet perestroika, there was a lot of optimism that they're going to round up the European integration. It's going to be really, all the way to the Euros. Turkey looked more third world. However, it was bringing very useful, big pool of very young, relatively uneducated, relatively undemanding, not very unionized, not terribly democratically minded labor. So it's basically the closest thing to China that Europeans could find nearby. Russia was coming with different assets, of course, big army, because nobody could say openly that European Union is the new reincarnation of German Empire, and therefore they had to be non-German military in Europe. So Russia therefore was quite welcome, but it did not work out. It did not work out, and it's a separate discussion, why. In the last 20 years, we see the leaders, very interesting leaders like Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Putin, almost simultaneously going through the same kind of stages. They start as pro-European westernizers, they are modernizers of their countries, and they end up being far-right nationalist dictators, not to say fascist, because let's leave fascism in the 1930s. They are both in the 2010s trying to cause trouble by picking up geopolitically low-hanging fruit, such as Abkhazia, the Crimea, or Syria, Libya, and now Karabakh. Something which wouldn't be very difficult, which wouldn't invite really serious response from the West, and in the future they might hope to exchange it for something, and that is going to be the biggest question. What can they plausibly exchange it for? Why are they doing this? It's quite obvious, I think, that this is a diversion. Who are suffering in the meantime, so well, you are very much like Poland in the 1930s, 1940s. You are just very unlucky to be under the wheels of the bus. but there you are, So now Armenia is very unlucky, Georgia was quite unlucky. For the moment, Azerbaijan is lucky, although I wouldn't bet in the longer run, having Russians, Turks, and Israelis simultaneously on your territory, while Iranians are watching anxiously from across the border, that's going to be an interesting spectacle to watch in the coming 5 to 10 years. So this is where we are now, so the South Caucasus region suddenly became strategically important, not because of all this poetry, and we have a lot of poetry about East meeting West, about the crossroads and all these things. This is very insignificant, the Caucasus is beautiful, but it's very insignificant. Even the amounts of energy resources are quite laughable by world standards, well, maybe Abu-Dhabi standards. Not to mention, that what is going to happen to all these carbon economies in the next 10 to 15 years. The Caucasus, South Caucasus is suddenly quite important simply because there are big troublemakers at the outskirts of Europe, and they're causing trouble. It's very dangerous, for the peoples in the Caucasus. It's quite unpredictable, and the West, so far, as we could see, they were at a loss, and that's why the war happened when it happened. It was a perfectly selected moment when Mr. Erdogan could expect no intervention, from the West, and this is where we are now. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Derlugian, for that historical and geographical overview of where we are now. I think this sets the scene very well for our next three speakers. I'd like to invite Professor Özkan to reflect on kind of Turkish policy and ways forward for Ankara now.
Thank you. I'm going to a little bit talk about the geopolitical balance of power and how it did change in the last couple of months. And then I am going to talk about the Turkish foreign policy. Well, the status quo in the region, in Nagorno-Karabakh and between Armenia and Azerbaijan, changed with the last war, which took 4 weeks. And this status quo, the former status quo, was set up in 1994 ceasefire agreement. And as a result of the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, Armenia occupied around 11,000 square kilometers of Azerbaijani territory. And it sealed its military victory with the 1994 ceasefire agreement. And roughly out of these 11,000 square kilometers, 4,000 square kilometers, around 1/3 was the autonomous region of Nagorno-Karabakh, the former Soviet autonomous region. And Armenians made up 75% of the population. And we are talking about around 150,000 Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh proper. The rest of 7,000 square kilometers was mainly populated by Azeris, and there was a little bit of Kurds, and there were almost 500,000 people. And as a result of the war and as a result of the Armenian occupation of these 7,000 square kilometers, 500,000 people moved, first to move from their homes. And Azerbaijan was one of the highest percentage of the IDPs, internally displaced people in the world. For the last 25 years, there were lots of peace negotiations. And during these peace negotiations, Yerevan insisted on 2 conditions. It is going to take control of the complete Nagorno-Karabakh region. And in addition to that, it wanted to control Lachin and Kalbajar regions, the 2 corridors basically linking Nagorno-Karabakh proper with Armenia. And in return, Armenian offer was Baku would get the 5 regions, namely Cebrail, Füzuli, Zengilan, Kubatlı, and Agdam. This Armenian offer was considered complete defeat for Baku, and since 1994 there had not been any development in negotiations, and Yerevan also did not compromise or step back from this maximalist position. And as a result of the 4 weeks war, Now the balance of power, the military balance of power and political balance of power completely changed in the region. And during the 4 weeks of war, it was a kind of a blitzkrieg type of war. Azerbaijani military took back Fuzuli, Zengilan, Cebrail, and Kubatli. And in addition to that, it also to control the Hadrut and historical Sushi city in the Nagorno-Karabakh proper. And the Azerbaijani side, just before a couple of days before the ceasefire agreement, Azerbaijani military was very close to Stepanakert, Hankendi according to Azeris, the capital city of Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous region. And they were almost very close to taking back the Stepanakert, and we see the Russian intervention, and the ceasefire agreement was forced by Russia, and which saved the Armenian side from a total military defeat, very similar to what happened in 1994 ceasefire agreement, just on the contrary. As a result of this ceasefire agreement, Baku regained the 5 regions around Nagorno-Karabakh region. And in addition to that, almost 1/3, 1/4 of the Nagorno-Karabakh proper, mainly the Hadrut city and the Susha. Azerbaijani gains are not limited to territory. More than 100 tanks of Armenia, Armenian side lost more than 100 T-72 tanks. When we compare it with Azerbaijani side, Azerbaijan has lost around 20 to 30 tanks. I mean, the Armenian side lost more than 3 or 4 times the tanks, and Armenian side also lost lots of military equipment during the war. Well, let's look at the Turkey's role after this brief introduction. One of the main reasons how Azerbaijani side, how Azerbaijani military victory was possible. This is a very important question for us to understand, because I went to many times to the region, including Azerbaijan and Armenia. And Armenian side had a geopolitical advantage. They were controlling the mountainous region, and they dig, for the last 30 years, they dig so many trenches facing the Azerbaijanis, and they were very confident for their military position in the region. And many military experts, independent military experts, considered Azerbaijani military victory almost an impossible because of the geographical balance. How was the Azerbaijani military victory possible? There was only one clear answer: unmanned aerial vehicles, basically the drones. And this Azerbaijani side bought these drones mainly from Israel, Harop drones, and from Turkey, TB2 Bayraktar drones. They were produced by Erdogan's son-in-law, Law's company. And Turkish side used these drones very efficiently against PKK in northern Iraq, in Syria, and in Libya. And Turkish side not only had an experience to manufacturing these drones, but also using them in the conflict. These drones changed the military balance of power significantly, and between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The foundation of the military cooperation between Turkey and Ankara did not start with Erdogan. It goes back all the way to 1990s. And according to the Russian media sources, at the beginning of the war, there were 600 Turkish military personnel helping to Azerbaijani side, mainly using how to use these drones very efficiently. And not only the 600 Turkish military personnel, but Turkish Minister of Defense, Hulusi Akar, and Commander of Land Forces, Ümit Dindar, were in Baku when the clashes started at the end of September, according to Russian media. And Turkish Minister of Defense, Hulusi Akar, mainly who directed this military operation from the Turkish side, he wrote his PhD thesis on the Armenian issue after the World War I in one of the most prominent Turkish universities, Boğaziçi University, in English. You can read this PhD thesis and read it in English. And therefore, he is not only militarily involved in this issue, but intellectually, he knows the region and the balance of power very well. In the Western and Armenian media, and also in the Russian media, some of the Russian media, this Turkish involvement in the Second Karabakh War were portrayed as pan-Turkism or expansionism of Erdogan in the region. it was seen a kind of a continuation of Turkey's expansionist foreign policy in Libya, Syria, and Eastern Mediterranean. It's portrayed as the last stage of Turkish military expansionism. As a critical scholar of AKP's foreign policy, and I wrote many articles, critical articles, I don't agree with this perspective. I argue that Karabakh and Turkey's foreign policy was quite very different from the Middle Eastern examples, Turkey's adventures in the Middle East, and it's exceptional, and let me explain why Turkish policy towards Karabakh is very different from Syria, Turkish adventures in Syria, Libya, and Eastern Med. Well, there are 5 reasons I'm going to name. Number 1, AKP's policy towards the Middle East was based on pan-Islamism. I use this term. I call it as a pan-Islamist foreign policy. It was a very sectarian, very Sunni-based foreign policy. And when the Arab uprising started in 2011, Turkey's foreign policy objective was, Turkey thought that this was Turkey's imagination, AKP's imagination. The Muslim Brotherhood parties in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, and in Palestine are going to come to power, and there is going to be a huge transformation of power in the Middle East, and there is going to emerge a Muslim Brotherhood belt in the region, all the way from Tunisia to Syria, and AKP is going to be the leader of that belt. Well, this vision completely failed. It was a wrong vision. It has nothing to do with the realities of the power. And this vision failed in the Middle East. However, in the case of Azerbaijan, we have a totally different picture. Azerbaijan is mainly Shia. It doesn't fit the Sunni worldview of AKP. And it was a very secular and state and society. Therefore, the pan-Islamist vision of AKP doesn't play a role here. Let me move to the second dynamic. Baku and Ankara relations was not based on this pan-Islamist vision, but it was based on an institutional framework. It was basically a military to military, economic to economic relationship. It was not an ideological relationship. Therefore, we're really talking about a different game here. Third, Turkey's proxies in the Middle East were weak, and mainly they were illegitimate. Some of them, in the case of Syria, were radical groups, some of the jihadist groups. However, in the case of Azerbaijan, we have a very well-established state, and it was a recognized state, and it was a legitimate actor. Therefore, Turkish foreign policy towards Azerbaijan and Karabakh is completely different. The fourth, from the international law point of view, Turkey tried to depose the Syrian regime, the legitimate Syrian regime. Although it was an authoritarian regime, it was also recognized by Turkey as the legitimate regime of Syria. In the case of Egypt, after the military coup, Turkey supported Muslim Brotherhood, which was recognized as a terrorist organization by the Sisi regime in Egypt. Well, of course, Sisi regime came to power as a result of a military coup, but it was recognized by all international actors. Therefore, Turkey was basically supporting an opposition power which was claimed as a terrorist organization by itself. However, in the case of Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, from an international law point of view, Nagorno-Karabakh was part of Azerbaijan, and even the so-called Artsakh Republic was not recognized by Armenia itself. And the fifth, I come to the fifth dynamic. Turkish foreign policy objective was very limited, very well designed, and it was a very timely event, very different from Turkey's objectives in the Middle East. First of all, it was coordinated with Russia. Russia was not out of the picture from Turkey's perspective. Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Israel cooperated together. Turkey did not act alone, and it didn't follow a maximalist strategy. When the ceasefire agreement was pushed by Russia, Turkey did not say, okay, we are winning this war, why are we signing this ceasefire agreement? We can take the whole Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey did not say that. It didn't follow a maximalist stance with Baku. I have to underline before concluding my speech, the Russian involvement, many Western media and NGOs and think tanks emphasized Turkey's influence, Turkey's intervention in Nagorno-Karabakh. However, I believe it played a very important role. Ankara played a very important role in the second Nagorno-Karabakh, but without Russian yellow light, Azerbaijan side could not dare to start this military operation. Basically, by doing that, by not giving a green light but yellow light to Baku, Kremlin reached two objectives. The first one was basically punishing the pro-Western regime in Yerevan, and helping the second helping Aliyev to gain part of its territory. Let me conclude with a basic optimistic perspective. Turkey broke its diplomatic relations with Armenia in 1993 when Armenian army military occupied the Kelbejer region. And since then, there were no diplomatic relations and borders are closed. However, I think there is an historic opportunity for Turkey and Armenia because now these territories, these Azerbaijani territories, were given back to Azerbaijan. Therefore, there is no excuse for Turkey to establish its diplomatic, cultural, and economic relations with Armenia and open the borders. I think this is a historic opportunity, and Turkey should use this opportunity to establish to mend its relations with its historic neighbor. And also, I think it's an opportunity for Turkey and Armenia and for the West to balance Russian role and Russian influence in Armenia, because Russian military and economic hegemony in Armenia was based on basically the so-called Turkish threat. And if Turkey uses this opportunity, it can change, although it sounds oxymoronic, I think it can change the balance of power once again in the region. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Özkan. I'd now like to pass the floor to Professor Morozov to give us an analysis maybe of the kind of how Russian foreign policy towards Karabakh has developed and maybe will develop. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I probably won't be able to give an overview of how Russia's policy has developed in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh over all those years, but of course, what I want to emphasize in the first place is that the main driving force of the Russian policy in the post-Soviet space overall, at least since 2012, has been keeping the West out at any cost. That's the red line that was absolutely present in all Russia's action, including Crimea, including Ukraine, and now Belarus, for instance. This is also the main concern. I mean, this line has been there probably always, ever since the establishment of Russian foreign policy. But since 2012, since the Arab Spring and the protests in Russia, this became the main driving force of Russian foreign policy in the region, and to some extent also globally. And we should whenever we approach the situation, trying to figure out what Russia did or didn't do, we should keep this in mind. And in that sense, I very much like this metaphor of yellow light used by the previous speaker, because what I think Russia did was something that it had to do, because mostly Russia's policy has been reactive over all those years and in all those conflicts. It reacted to what it saw as Western expansionism, interventionism, and so on. In this case, of course, there was no direct intervention from the West. Russia didn't blame the West directly for the outbreak of the war, but it definitely wanted to keep the West out, and it reacted to the events as it saw necessary in light of this major geopolitical goal that it sets for itself. And as a result of that, I don't think Russia in any way approved or pushed any of the parties into this conflict. Rather, what it did was not stopping Baku from engaging in this conflict, and it did it indeed because of this overarching objective to keep the West out. And it's not, I don't think it was that much about punishing Armenia or Pashinyan personally for allegedly pro-Western course, because Moscow understands very well that its pro-Westernness is very limited, but rather it was finding this very, very nice, very tiny or kind of tidy balance between different geopolitical priorities of the two countries, out of which one is Russia's ally in the CSTO, but the other one is very important geopolitically. And Russia's goal, in other words, in South Caucasus has been and was in this case no second Georgia. Russia wanted to prevent anything like the Georgian transformation that has happened ever since 2003, both in Armenia and Azerbaijan. It doesn't want to see it in either of those countries, and therefore it had to find a balance. And in a certain sense, it succeeded. I mean, the balance was found. Russia was very careful, very skillfully manipulating the actors, but at the same time, of course, it did have to make certain concessions in terms of its geopolitical influence, in terms of its trustworthiness as an ally. And in that sense, if we're talking about who won and who lost and what has changed in the situation, then I think that the observers in the West have been too hastily concluding that Russia has won because it now has peacekeepers there on the ground, and it gives Russia a lot of influence. That is probably true that Russia now has boots on the ground, not just in Armenia, but in Nagorno-Karabakh as well. And the Russian border guards will play a very important role in the region. But at the same time, of course, in many symbolic terms, Russia has lost. And I see a couple of aspects there. The first one was very visible, and it's already been mentioned, that's Turkey's involvement. It's actually the first time a player from outside the former Soviet space has been even indirectly, but still militarily involved in the conflict and somehow materially influencing the outcomes and actually swinging the outcome in favor of one of the players. Because I think without military cooperation with Turkey, indeed, there would have been no easy victory, no quick victory for Azerbaijan. And symbolically, I repeat, this is very important for Russia. It's, of course, Turkey is not seen as in any way a Western country, even though Turkey is in NATO. Turkey, it's kind of easier for Russia to find a common language with Turkey, because what Russia sees Turkey doing is approximately the same thing as Russia does itself, meaning that it pursues certain realist foreign policy goals. It doesn't have in mind any regime change, and especially in this region, it's non-ideological. So in that sense, Russia is more comfortable playing those geopolitical games with Turkey as it is with the United States. So that's one aspect, and in that sense, I think it reflects also the need to find a very neat balance between Russia's interests and Turkey's interests, and in that sense, it can be interpreted as Russia's concession. But of course, we have to keep in mind that at the same time, or even before that, Russia intervened in Syria, which in certain sense can be considered Turkish backyard. So in a certain sense, it was balancing the fact that Russia intervened in Syria and Turkey, Turkey might not have been very happy about that, but it kind of tolerated Russian involvement. In this case, Russia kind of paid back with in kind, so to say. And the second aspect, which I see as important, is I already mentioned trustworthiness and potential consequences of this conflict for Russia's influence in the region. I mean, yes, on the one hand, again, Russia has troops on the ground, its military presence has increased, but at the same time, I think the way the military victory was achieved by Azerbaijan illustrates how important it is to invest in pragmatic military cooperation with your neighbors, with whoever is there to help you develop militarily, to catch up, to find and procure state-of-the-art equipment, the most high-tech solutions on the market, and to be able to use those high-tech solutions effectively, as opposed to relying on your ally, which in many respects, despite the relatively successful military reform, still has a somewhat clumsy military, which is far less effective. And in many respects, of course, Russia's involvement in that case was limited to kind of providing defense to Armenia, providing equipment to Armenia. But as it turned out, whatever Armenia was able to procure from Russia was already out of date and was not, the use of that equipment was much less effective in the conflict. And even this transformation of air power, the transition to drones, and the almost total uselessness of artillery and tanks illustrate that as well, which in a certain sense puts Russia's trustworthiness as an ally into question. It doesn't do it directly because Russia did not abandon Armenia, but it does put a question mark over Russia's position as an ally in the CSTO and elsewhere. And also, of course, it creates new opportunities for other players in the region, not just Turkey, not just Iran, who are, of course, eagerly and very attentively watching this conflict, but also Tbilisi and Kiev. And let me just remind you that Guam is still alive, and actually Kiev keeps talking about reinvigorating the plan for a free trade zone within this organization. And in that sense, with some encouragement from Istanbul, this can eventually, at some point, maybe go ahead. I'm not predicting anything, but this is something where, again, the field is now much more open for other players to get involved and maybe potentially to make an impact. And then finally, let me just make a few observations about the potential impact of this conflict on Russia's relations with the West. Since I don't want to encroach on the next presentation, I probably limit my remarks to the US and the new administration in Washington, which I think in general would be inclined to see all developments in the region and outside the region, at least in Europe and former Soviet space, Greater Eurasia, so to say, along three related prisms. It's an anti-Russian prism because the US is fed up with Russia and its real or alleged intervention in US domestic affairs, Europe's affairs, and elsewhere. It will see everything through the prism of democracy, authoritarianism, opposition, and it will be inclined also, maybe to a lesser extent than the Trump administration, but it will still be moderately inclined to some sort of anti-Islamist prism. Because after all, I mean, despite all the progressive features of the new administration or incoming administration, the anti-Islamic feelings in the US are rather strong, and especially when it comes to politicized Islam, as opposed to Islam as a religion and as a cultural community. And in that sense, I think that in all those cases, the outcome of this conflict will be a cause for concern in the US, because they will see it as Russia increasing its presence, as authoritarian states increasing their influence in the region, as democracy taking a step back, as to some extent also Islamism being on the rise. I mean, I'm not saying that any of these interpretations is correct. What I'm saying is that this will be the inclination of this new administration. So potentially this might create tension between Moscow and Washington with regard to South Caucasus more generally. But fortunately, the balance of different, not just powers, but different connections and oppositions and contradictions in the region is so complex that it will be very difficult for Washington to decide on any active involvement, because it's Armenia would tend to be, and Georgia, of course, will probably be seen as struggling democracies, whereas Azerbaijan will be seen as an authoritarian regime. At the same time, there is this link via Guam to America's allies, and Turkey it will be a very complex picture for Washington to interpret. So I don't see any immediate fallout from that. But actually, I think Russia and the US will be watching each other very carefully with regard to this conflict. And I do not exclude the possibility of some sort of new geopolitical escalation related to this conflict, but maybe actually with a fallout elsewhere globally. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would now like to hand over to our final speaker, who is Joanna Hossa from ECFR, for her to give us an overview of what thoughts are from Brussels and, dare I say it, from London.
Yes, so hello everybody, lovely to join you for this discussion. So about the EU role, as we saw in the 2020 war, the EU's role in this conflict was very limited. Indeed, we can say that the EU entirely left the field to Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the bigger powers and troublemakers, as Professor Dalgan called them, Turkey and eventually Russia. And there are many reasons for that. If the EU made more efforts at conflict resolution in Nagorno-Karabakh before, now it doesn't really have the bandwidth to engage in it. The multiple crises that Europe country faces itself consume its attention entirely, including the COVID pandemic. But there are also deeper reasons for EU's non-involvement, and they have to do with the specifics of the Nagorno-Karabakh situation and the complexities of shaping the EU foreign policy more generally. So the thing is that EU common foreign policy is very tricky. It has been the EU's major dilemma for decades now, how to become a more united and a stronger foreign policy actor. Foreign policy is often the area very jealously guarded by EU member states, by the capitals who do not want to cede this power to Brussels. And in the case of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, not all EU member states see it the same way. And there are differences, quite significant differences between especially the states that face territorial conflicts itself and those who don't. So for example, France and Cyprus see the situation very differently. There are multiple disagreements within the Union as to how to approach Armenia and Azerbaijan. And as a result, the EU has long tried to remain as neutral as possible in the conflict. If it's tried to engage, often quite significantly via special representatives and other initiatives, it was never very intrusive for this reason that it wants to remain as neutral as possible. So another reason why the EU cannot be more decisive here is that it does not want and cannot, in fact, enter conflicts uninvited. It could theoretically try and deploy a CSDP mission in the area. And CSDP is a bit of a EU jargon, so it stands for Common Security and Defense Policy. And this is a tool that the EU has for action in the fields of defense and crisis management. And missions under this initiative, they have been previously deployed in Kosovo, Georgia, most recently in Ukraine. However, the EU cannot do it in Armenia or Azerbaijan and in the region because Armenia or Azerbaijan have not asked the EU for any such involvement. So the action stops there. Asking the EU for help would not have been very possible for Armenia and Azerbaijan, or at least very difficult, because Armenia, one reason, did not want to irritate Russia by pushing hard for a larger EU role, while Azerbaijan, for example, does not necessarily trust EU involvement, especially since most EU states recognized Kosovo's independence. Azerbaijan at one point really wanted to see unequivocal support for its territorial integrity from the EU, but this is not the position that the EU could take. So what the EU is doing And what the West is doing now, it's present mostly via the OSCE Minsk group. Also now after the ceasefire, the EU has stressed the importance of the Minsk group because there is a big concern that the ceasefire might still fall through, the war might be reignited. And so the work of the Minsk group is seen as a platform for all the actors to be involved and discuss the way forward and have a more sustainable solution. But looking again at what happened in 2020, the EU was largely helpless in the light of the great determination of Azerbaijan, that was in turn backed by Turkey. The absence of US mattered greatly, left a void in the region. The role and intentions of Russia were not quite clear for a long time. And all this was happening against a backdrop of flourishing Turkish-Russian cooperation. And it all left the EU helpless and slightly confused as well. Now with the Russian peacekeepers in the region, the room of maneuver for the EU is still very limited. But having said that, the EU should definitely make more efforts to remain an actor in the region. It matters for the EU narrative of safeguarding EU values in its close neighborhood. It matters for EU security, for the geopolitical situation of the future. So it's important that the US does what it can. So what it can is keep insisting on the role of the Minsk group. We have seen that the Minsk group has not been very welcomed by President Aliyev at certain points recently. So this is what the EU is pushing for and should be pushing for, to stress the importance of the continuation of a diplomatic process, of the importance of multilateral fora. And the Minsk group is now the best tool available for that. The EU is also likely to engage in post-war reconstruction. It would require consensus in the region, of course, for EU's involvement, but that should not be very difficult to obtain on this occasion because construction funds are usually more than welcome. And the EU is often seen as the cleaner who comes in after conflicts and to clean the mess up, and it's actually often even expected for the EU to play that role, and this might happen here again. The EU could also engage in peace-building projects, which is going to be the really challenging part because reconstructing buildings and bridges is much easier than overcoming the divides between people and the tensions. The EU has a lot of experience supporting such efforts and working with civil society, but we can observe, for example, in the Western Balkans, just how colossal the task is. But on this, we have much better peace-building experts here with us, so I won't dwell on that. So yes, this is. I will stop here for my short overview, and looking forward for the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Johanna, and the other speakers for this overview. From various perspectives of the great powers that are active in this region. We now have about half an hour, I would say maximum, for questions which you can pose in the chat or you can put your hand up. I would like to abuse my position as moderator to ask the first question. I'd like to, with reference to the meeting that happened yesterday in Moscow, as we know, both presidents were there to meet President Putin. And it appears that they were essentially only there to talk about one thing, which is about the economic developments that in theory could now happen following, I think, point 9 of the peace deal that was agreed in November. So this is about opening up opportunities for railways and roads to be built to connect Turkey through Nakhchivan, through Armenia, through Azerbaijan to Russia. So this brings us to rather more geo-economic questions of whether it's really possible, whether it really will happen that Russia and Turkey can be linked by kind of these sort of economic links, whilst the political situation is so tenuous, and I think will go on being tenuous. So to what extent the economic side can progress without the political side? I would be quite interested to hear, Professor Dirlugian, what you think about that, but also if any of the other speakers would like to chip in.
this situation shows that obviously something else is going on about which we can only guess. So we had more time. I will have to explain what is the principle of the Loch Ness monster. How can we study something which we cannot touch? But we suspect that there are many people who claim that they have seen the beast. Mostly we can learn by knowing other beasts. For instance, with the Loch Ness monster, we know two things for sure. If it is a big animal, it must eat and it must mate. So there is Papa monster, Mama monster, and baby monster, and they eat once in a while. So the question should always be very much Rudyard Kipling's question. What does crocodile eat for dinner? I don't think this is about trade at all. I think this is about supplying the Russian military in the front lines. I think Russia was caught unprepared. So there are many journalists and experts who pretend that they know some secret thinking in Putin's head. I will not pretend that he was trying to punish Armenia, or that he was in cahoots with Erdogan, or anything. I think the explanation is far more simple. In July last year, Azerbaijan, in another border clash with Armenia, lost a general and I think a couple officers. There was a riot in Baku, which of course, again, I always believe in natural causes. The great sociological principle of it happened on its own. Although there are people who suggest that it was organized by Ilham Aliyev, of course, like everything else in Baku, but I do believe that there was an element of spontaneity, and that was very threatening to the regime of Aliyev, because let me remind you, it's a sultanism attached to an oil derrick. So Aliyev had to throw the keys essentially to Erdogan, do whatever you think is necessary. So take our equipment, bring the proxies. And by the way, notice, we stopped hearing about the Syrian jihadis in the recent weeks, so what is going on? Quite interesting about it. So were they transported back? Speaking of transportation, President Aliyev previously said something interesting, that it will take less than 2 years to build the railroad that had already existed from Baku to the border of Armenia. And then apparently transportation will have to be over trucks or lorries, from Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan. And it will be under the control of Russian FSB border guards. Doesn't sound at all like a military corridor or even a trade corridor. I don't share any optimism about the opening of economic cooperation in the region. If you're going to do that, why remind Armenians about Enver Pasha and others and other people who were actually convicted by international court as organizers of the first genocide? That was something outside the range of the usual, let's put it this way. So I think we are going to see much more and much more interesting. Obviously, there is trade going on. Turkey is interested in offering its military hardware and military assistance to the Central Asian states in preparation for the moment when American defenses collapse in Afghanistan and what is going to happen next. So who is going to be better protection when Americans leave? Russians or Turks? Or maybe it's Iran, or maybe it's for the whole region. There was a question here also about Batumi and something. I would discount the last part, because Batumi or Adjara used to be in Ottoman Empire. I would say that the explanation is much more mundane. Turkey and Azerbaijan are third world countries with high fertility rates. They simply outnumber Armenians and Georgians. They will be settling, if the borders are opening, they will be splashing, just by default. Because, I'm sorry, I did not kill one of the telephones. So somebody will be settling down. A spectacular number, which explains also so much about Mr. Erdogan's support base, is that Istanbul, historically, had a population of up to 1 million people. In the times of Emperor Justinian of Byzantium, it was about 1 million. In the times of Kanuni Sultan, it was about 1 million. In 1968, it was 1 million. How big is Istanbul now? Anybody can tell me? 29 million? More than 30? Just tells you something. What was the population of Trabzon in 1970? Less than 100,000. What is Trabzon now? So there is a demographic expansion which is going on, and I don't think there is much chance, for the South Caucasus, to escape it. Let me shut up here.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to ask Professor Özkan maybe to reply on the economic question, what is Turkey really looking for in an economic sense? And then maybe answer the question around the future of Turkish-Georgian relations after this conflict.
Sure. The second Karabakh, you can name the second Karabakh anything but not surprise. It was not a surprise war. Everyone interested in the region was expecting that. I mean, in 2016, there was Azerbaijanis used Israeli harps very efficiently, and they took control of a small pocket of territory, and for the last 5 years did nothing. Because they were overconfident, and with 2.5 million population and 80% of your borders closed, you cannot expect to insist on your maximalist demands. And on the other hand, the other side, the Azerbaijani side, is getting revenues this war, and this outcome was not a surprise for me. Again, the Russian involvement was much more important than Turkey and other great powers. The Russia was the deal maker, overestimate Turkey's role. However, as in any other geopolitical dilemma, the Russian the strategy can backfire. And I tried to mention in my speech, but once again, I want to emphasize this. For the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Turkey and Armenia to establish diplomatic, cultural, and economic relations, because for the last 30 years, the biggest problem for Armenians in Armenia, for diaspora, historical problems are much more important than the economic problems of Armenians. And however, if you talk to Armenians in Armenia, their number one problem is opportunity to open this border and to decrease the Russian involvement in Armenia, because the Russian involvement in Armenia is legitimized by the deadlock between Armenia and Turkey. If there is not going to be a military threat, if there is not going to be a closed borders, if there is not going to be a close diplomatic relation, there is no need for Russian military involvement and Russian hegemony in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. And therefore, I think there is an historic opportunity. And I am very critical of Erdogan regime, but Erdogan is a pragmatic leader. He is a realist, and his number one problem is to improve his relations with the United States. And with the new Biden presidency, he has a card in his hand to sell to the American public opinion and the new Biden administration. That is opening the border and improving its relations with Armenia. This is going to be the biggest card in his hand, and I'm very optimistic that he's going to use that card. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Marozo, I just wanted to ask you also about yesterday's Moscow meeting and what you think about the emphasis on the economic side at the expense of everything else, whether you see that as significant or not.
Yeah, well, I basically agree with Georgi about the fact that it's probably not, I mean, the declared theme was probably not the main one, and we don't really know what the main one was. But in terms of potential economic development, I think that Russia stands to gain the least from that. So that's also one of the reasons why I think what they discussed was something else, and probably military transit. That's a very plausible hypothesis because I mean it's kind of difficult for the Russian military to supply its troops other than by air, and that's of course expensive and unstable and depends on the goodwill of other states in the region, which of course in all respect problematic. But for the same reason, there is not much to gain for Russia from the current arrangement because it's simply geographically, I mean, this corridor doesn't mean much for Russia. Trading with Armenia, yes, maybe, but whatever is there is already happening through Georgia, maybe by other channels, and it's not in any way. It's not a big market. It's a relatively small in terms of economic significance. It's almost negligible. Trading with Turkey, well, they have the Black Sea between them, and it's much more convenient to ship goods by sea than and of course the pipelines are there and so on. And I mean I could continue, but I think if you look at the map, the countries that stand to gain more are definitely Turkey, because it can use this new corridor from Nakhichevan via southern Armenia into Azerbaijan, and to extend it into Central Asia. That's one potentiality. And of course, even China might actually win from that in the long run, at least, because China, as we all know, is developing its Belt and Road Initiative, and Russia is one transit country, but only one transit country, and probably not the most convenient in all respects for China in that regard. So any new corridor, in principle, would be of interest to China, and Chinese investment might follow if there is, an agreement, a political agreement on that between the regional players. So in that sense, I share the skepticism about the declared call of yesterday's meeting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Joanna, I just wanted to bring you in here. I don't know if you want to comment also on yesterday's meeting, but also to maybe comment on, we have, obviously because we have a slight majority Georgian audience, people are wondering what this means for Georgia, and whether the West or the America might change its policy towards Georgia. I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't expect the Biden administration to be overly ambitious on foreign policy at the moment, to be honest. They have so many troubles on their own front, and their first priority will be to fight the pandemic, which has really gotten out of hand in the country, and reinstore some kind of unity, or at least prevent further escalation of the conflict within the country. Americans have been very, very, very deeply shocked by the events of last week, and well, now maybe on some rather extremist sides they are talking of a civil war, which is a bit exaggerated, I think, but not entirely to be discarded as a possibility by the U.S. Administration. So I think all efforts will be on making sure that the situation doesn't get out of hand in the country. And in Eastern Europe, there are lots of hopes with coming with the Biden administration. Also, Ukraine is very hopeful that he will be more engaged in Ukraine because of all his experience in Ukraine. And yes, he has a lot of experts on the Caucasus within his team. But I think it won't come immediately. Maybe the policy will be to reinstate the status of NATO and faith in NATO that was very, very undermined by President Trump. So that would be one way of helping the region, to do it via NATO, to reinstore cooperation with Turkey as well. But I wouldn't expect any military initiatives for sure, or anything significant from the Americans for now.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking through the questions in the comments. And there's one very specific one on Turkey from Sandro Bakuradze, which I would leave to Professor Özkan to deal with. But we also have an interesting one from USA about Georgia as a mediator between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And this question of who the mediator should be, if we need a mediator at all, is always an interesting one in any conflict, but specifically in this one, because the need to be and to be perceived to be neutral and impartial is so important. I would like to put this question to you, Georgia, as to what you feel the Georgian government, can Georgia really play a mediating kind of role here?
Mediating, so that implies that Georgia has diplomatic and international agency. You know, that this is, I'm sorry, I'm neither diplomat, as you can see, nor I don't think that anybody in the South Caucasus at the moment possesses independence, you know, and can play any diplomatic role. Georgia needs to survive in this new changing situation, which is going to be rather challenging, because, as I said, you know, the challenges are quite different. Of course, you know, Israel and the United States are interested in building, maybe still maintaining a staging ground for a war against Iran, which Iran, of course, realizes as well. You know, Russian interests are more military and geopolitical rather than geoeconomic. Turkey is an Asian country in the sense that they have actively growing population, basically what produced the AKP phenomenon, right? So Turkey has just, and we probably should have explained, you know, what was AKP, you know, because this is a Turkish acronym. The Justice and whatever, you know, is it Justice and Development Party? I think AK Party.
I think so. AK Party, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something like well, basically, you know, the previous party vehicle of Mr. Erdogan. I'm not sure to what extent he relies on it any longer, you know, because there were so many defections there. However, you know, that was a revolution in Turkey, you know, that the Turkish state, as we knew it previously in the 20th century, had been demolished and purged very seriously. And that became possible because of the millions and millions of rural inhabitants coming from inner Anatolia. And they're coming not, well, they would prefer majority to go west, you know, because the cities are better, you know, to go all the way to Germany if they can. If they cannot, then all the way to Istanbul. But really, when you cannot get even to Istanbul, then why not go to Tbilisi or to Yerevan? You know? So there is a demographic expansion going on. I would speak more about it in the years to come. So I think, you know, Russians are trying to pursue what very 19th century strategy, railroad imperialism. You know, because even once you build the railroad, it has, let me remind you, it has a certain gauge, you know, between the rails. Mm-hmm. And the Russian rail is different from West European rail. So there are all these questions, you know, what kind of rail will be built. But it's quite obvious that if Russians are trying to open up the connection to what they call Transcaucasia, they will have to try to open up the connection via Abkhazia and Georgia. So it's logical. It will have to be there next. So where will be Georgia in all of this? You know, now that you know that there will be no more war, you know, that local governments, they exist as kind of, you know, international fiction. They are satellites to one degree or another. Armenia is a satellite of Russia. Azerbaijan is now a satellite of Russia and Turkey, which makes it so much more interesting, and a dependency of several other countries. Georgia, I will let you decide. And in this situation, is there much leeway at all what we can do? Because we are, if we are policy experts, people always expect from us prescriptions. Are there any prescriptions in this game?
Thank you. That's a good question. And your point about the gauge of the railway is very true, as we see when actually we go into Poland for Belarus, I remember. The other question about railways, opening up of railways, is whether it's profitable or not. So who sees an economic interest and who doesn't? And I just wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that we've done, International Alert has done research on this in the past. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat for people who want to see what is deemed profitable and what isn't, both for Armenian Azerbaijan railways and also from Georgia through Abkhazia to Russia. Behlul, I wonder if we could come back to you on Turkish policy. I mean, there's quite a specific question around the MHP, but I mean, maybe this is more around kind of domestic Turkish politics and how that influences the situation.
Sure. There are also a couple of questions that I would like to briefly comment, quick answers. I don't think MHP and its nationalist ideology played a role towards Turkey's policy towards Azerbaijan and in this war. In Turkey, all parties are nationalist. I don't think there is much difference between them. Except the Kurdish party HDP, and as I try to emphasize in my speech, this Turkey's policy towards Karabakh and Azerbaijan was not ideological; it was more institutional. Therefore, MHPs and Cumhur İttifakı, the alliance, ruling alliance, ideology did not play much role there. There was also a question about the Ajara region and irredentist claims on that. I should remind you that in the Abkhazia conflict, Turkey, since the beginning, supported Georgia. And Georgia plays a very important role in Turkey's policy towards Caucasus. And I don't think there is any possibility about Turkish irredentist claims towards Ajara. About the status of the future status of Karabakh, I think Aliyev also prefers the current status of Karabakh, keeping Karabakh Armenians in there and Russian military protecting them, because if Azerbaijan would have captured the whole Karabakh, there is going to be a big question of what is Azerbaijan going to do with them, and what kind of and believe me, there was no possibility for Azerbaijan to satisfy Karabakh Armenians without giving them full independence. And therefore, this is a very much preferred situation for Aliyev. Basically, he created a kind of an open prison guarded by Russian military and controlling the Lachin corridor. And in the future, he might convince Karabakh Armenians to sign a deal with Baku in order to get rid of this open prison status. And the last question is, I think this is a very important question for us. From Georgi, Aliyev showed that territorial problems can be solved by military means. Does this mean that Georgia should also view this solution? I totally disagree with you. This second Karabakh did not show us that you can solve territorial problems only by military means. You have to calculate the time. You have to establish balance of power, made alliances, because Azerbaijan made alliance with Turkey and Israel, and also kind of tacit support of Russia. And it was not a unilateral move. It was quite contrary that Georgia's move in 2008 towards South Ossetia. Therefore, we have to understand the second Nagorno-Karabakh war with its diplomatic, economic, and alliances background. Thank you.
And I would add to that that the idea that the conflict has now been solved is a dubious one at best. I mean, we have peacekeepers in place for a reason, and the situation is all very tenuous. So I wouldn't say that Aliyev has necessarily demonstrated everything that he thinks he has. Professor Morozov, I was wondering if you would like to comment further, maybe on some of the questions here, but in particular on the future of the peacekeepers that Russia now has in Karabakh, and to what extent they're in a sense, I mean, they're actually quite vulnerable there to many things, no? And to what extent their presence can be manipulated, and how Moscow looks at that.
Yes, well, to start with this question, they are indeed, in military terms, they are indeed vulnerable, but at the same time, diplomatically speaking, I mean, I find it hard to imagine, given the current balance of power in the region and the kind of geopolitical layout, who might gain from openly attacking the peacekeepers or trying to push them out, or in any way directly offending Russia, because it's still an important player. It still has significant military presence in Armenia proper, and it will also increase its presence with the border guards deployed and so on. And in that sense, I mean, again, it's a question of diplomacy, and Russia, with all its shortcomings, Russian diplomacy in these games, in this type of games, has been relatively effective. Look at Syria, look at the region, I mean, the South Caucasus itself. I think in that sense, Russia has reasonably, okay, maybe not good relations, but working relations with all major players involved, including Iran, including Turkey, with all the fallout from the Syrian conflict and everything else. I mean, the history of recent years, diplomatic relations with Turkey in particular, shows how Russia has been able to handle all sorts of crises, and without actually alienating Turkey. And again, I want to emphasize this fact that for Russia, it's much easier to play this regional game because it understands the players. It understands what Iran wants. It understands what Turkey wants. It understands what Azerbaijan wants, and so on. And actually, it's much more difficult for Russia to understand Georgia, I think. And this is where we are actually back to those questions about the potential US involvement and what Russia might do about that and so on. I mean, I agree with you, Anna, that indeed the Biden administration will be preoccupied with domestic matters. And also let's again not forget about China, which actually de facto has been priority number one for the United States, at least at the level of declarations and kind of declared interests ever since Obama. And under Trump, it has been the case. I mean, both those presidents were rather reluctant to engage elsewhere. They did, but not because they wanted. I mean, in principle, they would have preferred dealing more with China and less with Europe and the Middle East, but they had to deal with all those regions. And in that regard, I think, yes, the Biden administration will try to look elsewhere, but at the same time, there will be a lot of push and pull on the part of East Europeans and the EU, which is probably going to, again, try to produce some sort of Eastern Partnership 2.0, or I think this is where Brussels is looking at the moment, maybe with a different type of resources and so on. And in that sense, I think symbolically speaking, Washington would want to engage with both Ukraine and Georgia, and the appointments in the new administration are indeed indicative of that. So, I mean, if I were an advisor to the Russian government, I would tell them take it easy. But unfortunately, this is exactly what the Russian government has trouble doing. They cannot take it easy whenever the US is involved, even if it's a symbolic involvement. They're always thinking and trying to figure out somewhat conspirologically what comes next. will there be an invitation for Georgia to join NATO or something along those lines, increased military cooperation as an outcome, eventual outcome of all that. So even symbolic cooperation can be, in a certain sense, or at the level of declarations and so on, it can be quite annoying to Moscow. And in that sense, but at the same time, I agree that it will probably not go beyond symbolic. So it will be very frustrating for everyone eventually, because everyone will be even less happy with each other in this game. Georgians and Ukrainians will not be happy with Americans because Americans will not give them what they want. Americans will be frustrated with Russia and with Ukraine and probably Georgia as struggling democracies. Russia will be frustrated with everyone because they will see the specter of the Orange Revolution everywhere. So in that sense, I'm pessimistic, but well, we've been there. So let's see what comes next.
I would tend to agree. Joanna Hossa, talking of symbolic things, what do you think about Eastern Partnership 2.0? And specifically, I would say, actually, when we talk about Ukraine a bit in the same breath, I mean, Ukraine has the advantage of having big EU countries right next to it. Who would you say of the East European countries in the EU are actually pushing for Brussels to take an interest in this region?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, the Eastern Partnership is very much struggling to find its role and mission. It's at every summit, the EU leaders are discussing how to reshape it, reframe it, and they're very much desperately looking for new ideas. We don't know how it will shape itself in the years to come, but I think there will be a push for more differentiation between the countries, and the countries that are most promising and pushing for more sort of engagement are Ukraine and Moldova, that are most EU looking towards the EU. Moldova is of course different from Ukraine. Is insisting that it's not anti-Russian. Wants to engage with both sides. Ukraine is more open about its clear pro-European stance. Of course, then we have Georgia in the Caucasus, but that's more complicated for the EU, and there's somewhat less interest because of because of the distance. Of course, we need to see how the situation shapes in Belarus. It's very complicated. There were hopes that there would be a role for the EU to engage. Those hopes are now largely suspended. Yeah, the Eastern Partnership is a struggling project.
Okay, I think on that note, I think we've answered all the questions, unless any of the speakers wants to come back with any last thoughts. But if not, then I would like to thank all speakers, Professor Lugianu, Özkan, Morozov, and Joanna Hossa, and I would like to thank the audience for attending as well. If you would like to know more about what International Alert does on Karabakh, you can find it through a website, and in particular I would refer you to the publication on railways that I put in the link. Thank you very much to Caucasian House for organizing this and hosting it, and I hope that we can see you all again at a future event.